Welcome to the 2015 Iowa City Book Festival, presented by the Iowa City UNESCO City of Literature. We would like to thank the sponsors who made this event possible, and those are the City of Iowa City, the University of Iowa, the Iowa Arts Council, Sheraton Iowa City, the Iowa City Public Library, the Iowa City Coralville Convention and Visitors Bureau, Bradley and Riley PC, Knudsen Construction, Film Scene, and the Iowa Review. And today we are to hear from Linda Gerdner and Linzee McCray. We're a little alarmed because Linda Gerdner is not here yet. We're going to start with Linzee, and if Linda comes in, we will proceed with Linda as well. And I will just do a brief introduction of Linda now so that she can just start once she's here. Linda Gerdner collects Hmong Story Cloths and has traveled to Hmong villages in rural Laos and the last refugee settlement in Thailand. She is the author of Hmong Story Cloths, Preserving Historical and Cultural Treasures. Linzee McCray is a freelancer and regular contributor to the Etsy blog, modist blog The Cutting Table, and a columnist for the French magazine Quilt Country. She has more than 2 decades of experience writing for magazines, including Stitch, where she is contributing editor, American Patchwork and Quilting, Uppercase, Quilts and More, Quilt Sampler, Parents, and others. She is the author of Art Quilts of the Midwest. Please join me in welcoming Linzee.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. Can you hear? Okay, good. The format is planned to be that I'll talk for about 25 minutes, and then I'll leave 5 minutes for questions, and then Linda hopefully will be here and will do her bit as well. I do have one piece to share with you, which is behind the screen, so I'll raise that up during the question period. But for right now, we'll just share PowerPoint issues.
Are you muted still?
I don't think so. They said they could hear me.
They're hearing you with.
Okay, go ahead. Okay. So let me just tell you briefly about this is kind of a speed version, and I apologize if I'm talking too fast, or please ask questions. But Art Quilts of the Midwest kind of came to be. I've done a lot of freelance writing related to textiles, and friend and editor Holly Carver at the University of Iowa Press was interested in a quilt book. They'd done a traditional quilt book. And so we talked about some different ideas. And one concept that I'm always really interested in is I'm from California. I moved to the Midwest in the 70s. And when I did, I sort of noticed that my color sense was different than all my friends. I had a lot of friends who were artists, and they kind of, went to the ochres and the greens and the browns. And I was sort of the blues and purples and greens. And I always felt a little out of it. And I didn't quite understand what it was about. And then after 11 years in Iowa City, I moved back to California where I'd grown up. And I was just like, oh, this is it. There's the ocean. It was water colors. And the light is a little bit different in California. It's a little more golden. And so I've always been really interested in what it is that shapes a person's visual aesthetic. And I thought that would be kind of an interesting concept for a collection, to have people, art quilters, who had been influenced by the Midwest, and they were free to choose what that influence would be. So it could be the weather, it could be the geography and the seasons, or it could be the fact that you have a neighbor who brings you a hot dish when you're sick, or it could be anything you wanted. And so we let the artists make that decision. So we put out a call for entries, and we had nearly 100. And I had 2 of Iowa City's finest visual artists, one of whom is in the audience, Emily Martin and Mary Merkel Hess, helped me select. And it was a really challenging process because we had really strong entries, and I feel like that's made it a really strong book, which makes me really happy. And I also feel like the book has a lot of variety. There are a lot of different kinds of pieces in this book. I'm going to quickly talk about what I have someone described to me as the 3-legged stool of the quilting world. And I'm doing this because when I gave this book to my aunt, my 89-year-old aunt, who I thanked in the acknowledgments because she taught me to knit, she said, well, it's nice, but there aren't any pretty quilts. And, and I think what she meant was there aren't any traditional quilts. And so I just want to talk briefly about the different kinds of quilting. that are sort of known in the quilt world now, although Linda is going to, I hope Linda gets here because I think it's fantastic that we're both talking about stories, quilts, textiles that were made based on a story or tradition or a culture. But traditional quilts, and you can kind of read this yourself, or, you know, are the ones that you think of when you think about a quilt on your bed. You know, there are patterns there are hundreds of patterns, and you know, bow tie, log cabin, 9-patch. I mean, they're drunkard's path. There are tons of them. And the blocks, one of the things that I think is really typical of traditional quilts is that the blocks will often interact to do a secondary pattern. So I'm going to show you a couple, an example. These are taken from an exhibit that was called Infinite Variety that was in New York, although this was just a small variation of that in Texas. But these are traditional quilts. And you can see, for example, that you see the stars on this quilt on your right, but then you also can see the diamonds and the squares that it makes. And that's a traditional sort of way of the secondary patterns, the blocks interacting. So those are examples of some traditional quilts. The second leg of the stool is kind of a new thing. It's called modern quilting. And I wrote my first story about modern quilting for Etsy in 2010. And modern quilting really grew from people sort of sewing in their basements. A lot of them didn't know about how to sew particularly. They're very influenced by graphic design, and that was a big influence for a lot of them. And they started putting their work online and in blogs and on Flickr, and pretty soon they found other people who were interested as well. The quilts of Gee's Bend, and also Amish quilts, the old-fashioned, very graphic, simple Amish quilts were also an influence for modern quilting. Modern quilts are primarily functional, although I'm seeing more and more that they're being also made for the wall. So there's some definite crossover between art quilting. And I'll show you some examples of those things at the bottom in some modern quilts. This quilt uses a traditional element, which is flying geese, and this is actually called 50 Shades of Geese. And it also shows you the solid fabrics in use and the sort of the negative space. So that's a way of taking a traditional block and making it modern, and it's very graphic. This is an example, this quilt is an example of improvisational piecing, and I apologize, I don't have the quilter's name. But, you know, pieces that are randomly put in, they're making an image, but they're not, it's not a traditional block, it's not blocks that interact with one another. And often in an improvisationally pieced quilt, you're going to find pieces that are not necessarily cut straight, and that, you know, intentionally or pieced in a regular way. I do want to mention, too, piecing is the sewing together of the fabrics. Quilting is the putting together of the layers. So a quilt is really defined as just 3 layers, a top, a bottom, and something in the middle that are held together by stitching. And this shows you an example of the use of negative space in a modern quilt. And I also think this gives you a good example of how modern quilters are using the quilting, which is the stitching, a little bit differently. You know, this is very much a graphic element that contributes to the overall quilt. And good quilts usually have good stitching. The quilting is good, but it's not necessarily so graphic as this. And they're using that negative space as an area to really show off the quilting. So those are modern quilts. And then what the book is about, which are art quilts. And art quilts were started in 1971. The Whitney Museum, for the first time ever, hung quilts on the wall as art. And they were traditional quilts, but it was the first time that anyone really looked at a quilt and thought of it as a piece of art. And it really started a movement. Astrid Bennett, who wrote the foreword in the book, was one of the people who remembers being really influenced by that and switching her focus to textiles. So the top is a definition. SAQA, S-A-Q-A, is Studio Art Quilters Association, and it's the organization that art quilters work through. And you can see that it doesn't even have to actually be a quilt, it just has to reference a quilt. But it's a large movement, probably not as large as traditional or modern quilting. So those are the definitions of, and now I'm going to share with you some of the art quilts that are in the book. This first piece is by Gail Barr, and Gail grew up in Minnesota, and She lives now in Buffalo Grove, Illinois. But she said her big influence growing up in Minnesota was shapes. She saw these big shapes. Barns, big green fields. Her family every summer would travel to Lake Superior, and they would see the big ore boats, and she just loved those great big shapes. She said that she hand dyes all her fabric, and she limits the number of fabrics in a piece because she doesn't like that to interfere with your seeing the shapes. That's really her big thing. She also likes her shapes to look hand cut. So although they're straight, they're not perfectly straight. That's important to her as well. Gail is a cellist, and she's been told that her quilts have movement, and she thinks that's related to being a musician. And the other thing, I'm going to show you a detail. She quilts her quilts in one direction. She said she's tried both directions, and she feels like it interferes with the shapes. And she says that this dense quilting gives it sort of the feel of an artist's canvas. So this is not something that you would want to snuggle under because it wouldn't fold easily because of the dense quilting. It has that feel of an artist's canvas. The next piece is by Diane Nunez, and this piece is by Bonnie Peterson. And I just love this piece, and one of the things I'm so excited about is that there are going to be 2 exhibitions based on this book from January through March. There'll be 2 small shows at the International Quilt Study Center in Lincoln, Nebraska, and from mid-July to mid-October, there's going to be a show at the National Quilt Museum that will encompass all the quilters in the book. And I can't wait to see all these pieces in person because the ones I've gotten to see it's just so fun. And this piece especially, there's so much going on in this piece that I can't wait to see it in person. Bonnie calls herself a rabble-rouser. All of the quilts that she makes have some sort of a message, social activism. She's very interested in the environment. This was a piece that she put together after, as part of a project working with the University of Wisconsin. They paired scientists and artists with the idea that scientists would be able to express, possibly to the public, the themes of the scientific experiments in a different way that might be more understandable. And Bonnie was paired with limnologists studying lakes around Wisconsin where people were living on them, and sort of what the effects of those people's habitation was on the water. So she included things like an invasive species, which is the rusty crayfish. She has an MBA, and she's very fond of graphs and charts, so she put a lot of those in there too. And the other thing that's great about this piece is that if you're familiar with quilts, I haven't talked about crazy quilts, but you may have seen crazy quilts. They're those ones that you find in antique stores. They're often made of velvets and men's suiting, heavy fabrics. They're pieced in a kind of wonky, not a regular way, and between the pieces there's often a lot of embellished embroidery stitching. And a lot of people call them the very first art quilts. So it's kind of fun that Bonnie did that. And I'll show you a detail. One of the things that she does, she has all kinds of definitions in this piece. And she said, I don't really expect anyone's going to stand and read them all, but she said, if somebody reads one and then they hear it on the news and it makes them more aware, that's a great thing. And she, the other thing she does is that the writing is all done with free motion quilting on her machine, which I think is pretty amazing because you can easily read it. So, and then you can see the stitching that she's done to attach all the pieces. So this is a piece that always evokes the question, is it really a quilt? Because you look at this and you think, really? And all of the pieces, this piece is by Diane Nunez, who's from Michigan, and she, all of her pieces that she submitted were 3-dimensional. And one of them would have been impossible to even have in the book because it was different from like 3 different angles, so we would have had to have too many pictures, so it wouldn't have worked. But they're really, came to art quilting from being a jeweler. And so she's very familiar and comfortable using metals, and this has rods and O-rings. And again, it fits the definition of a quilt because it's 3 layers sewn together. And if I show you the detail, you can see those layers. Diane hand dyes all her fabrics, and every piece I've seen of hers is just dramatically different. This piece for her evokes the feeling of the light on the hills in Michigan where she lives. She says driving along, and you see the changes of the light on the rolling hills. And so that was her connection to the Midwest. It was fun also in talking to these art quilters because a lot of them did not come to art quilting from quilting. They came from other forms of art. And so it's varied. It's all over the place, while some do come from quilting. But one of the things that I did in the book, for each artist, I interviewed each artist and wrote a biography. So there's a 400-word biography, short, but it's in there. And it was a challenging thing to feel like I was representing them and their art, you know, in a fair way. I feel like it's a lot of responsibility. But it was one of the things that I loved, and I loved learning where each quilter came from in their journey to art quilting. This is a piece by Jackie Goering, and it's called Bridges. And Jackie is actually one of the founders of the modern quilt movement. She's one of those people who was quilting in her basement and had a blog, Tall Grass Prairie Studios, which just took off. And she's now the president of the Modern Quilt Guild, which has many thousands of members. And Jackie had moved from Kansas City to Chicago and was walking her dog every day under bridges, and she just noticed them. And she came home one day and she decided to piece these bridges. So she pieced, they're not actual bridges, she said, just representations. And she put this up on her blog, and a friend immediately emailed her and said, I want to quilt that. And her friend had been worked for an engineering firm and was really attracted by all the shapes. And I don't know if you can see, but there are words that are in here. She said span was the one word that she gave the woman who quilted it because she had a lot of engineering terms that she wanted to include. But she has Kansas City and Chicago, which were the two places that she was living, passage, connect. And then one of the interesting things is the binding is this edge on the quilt, and she left that corner of the binding. She did it in a different color because she said, I wanted to leave it open because you never know what will happen. And indeed, by the time the book was getting ready to go to press, I had to say that she had moved back to Kansas City. She had left Chicago. So she knew what she was about. And here's a detail where you can see this is incredibly densely quilted, matchstick quilting it's often called, and then very artfully done to leave that word there so that the words pop out like that. All right. This quilt is by Donna June, who's from Chicago. It's called Hoagie Carmichael's Serenade, and it's a little bit different than the other quilts in that it's a whole cloth quilt, so it's just one piece of fabric, and it's painted. And whereas many of the other artists told me when they're starting out they don't know exactly what their quilt's going to look like, Donna June always knows what it's going to look like because she's got this paint that's going to dry, and she needs to plan it out ahead of time. This quilt is based on the songs of Hoagie Carmichael, who's from Indiana, and so it has a lot of references to Indiana. There are little pictures, which are postcards of the Wabash River. This is the state tree of Indiana. And Donna June worked she was a docent at the Field Museum in Chicago, and she's really interested in topographical maps and in fossils. Her other piece in the book has fossils. So this edge is based on a topographical map of the Wabash River. And here's a detail. There's very little stitching in this. She said she used just a little here and there to create some texture. And, sorry, I feel like I'm rushing here. This quilt is by LuAnn Rimel, and I just love the story behind this quilt. LuAnn is really interested in time. She's obviously a photographer. She takes her pictures at, a lot of her pictures at the Bell Fountain Cemetery in St. Louis, where she's from. And she's very attracted to hands. And she said she's a 17-inch printer. She came to quilting from painting and photography. And she said that she uses the cloth that she uses, in part because it fits the 17-inch printer, but also because it's very dear to her, she uses flour sack towels to print on. And she uses them because she said she has this memory of, as a girl, having to do the dishes and hating to have to do the dishes. But at the same time, she and her sisters would talk and sing. And then when she was getting she had met her husband-to-be, and it was a very quiet family, and she said it wasn't until she would go into the kitchen with her mother-in-law-to-be, and her mother-in-law would do the dishes and hand her a flour sack towel to dry, that then she would start telling her stories about the family. And so she feels like they're a conversational conduit, these towels. LuAnn does incredibly dense quilting, which and changes the direction very subtly and will change the color of the thread very subtly. So you can see some of the stitching goes this way, some goes this way. And she also does very subtle piecing based on a Japanese technique called boro. And there's an example of a piece I got to see in person that she was working on, so you can get a sense of how dense that stitching is. This is one of the more traditional pieces in the book. It's by Shelley Burge from Lincoln, Nebraska, and I think it's just a really artful example of using a lot of different fabrics in a very subtle way. The blues behind there create a lot of movement. If you're a quilter, you'll appreciate that Shelley made this quilt and then she didn't like it, and so she ripped off the binding and she cut off a big chunk of the side, and then she decided to very haphazardly piece these homespuns on the left in sort of an example of a utility quilt that someone would use just to keep warm, not anything artful, and sewed that on. And I just really think that makes the quilt. I think it's really a great piece. And it's based on a Willa Cather story, an author from Nebraska. And this is the last piece. This is by Shin Hye Jin, and Shin Hee is a really interesting person. She's originally from Korea. She has lived both on the East Coast and the West Coast and in Michigan, and she's currently a professor, an art professor at McPherson College in Tabor, Kansas. And she's very patient, and these are all actually, and I'll show you a detail, but they're all stitched by hand, all of these portraits. One of the things Shin Hee loves is to use recycled materials. So this is actually an old coverlet that their family had. It's a piece of a silk coverlet that was getting worn. She likes to do that both for the sustainability aspect, but also because she said if you use old materials, you don't worry about wrecking them. You know, it's not like you have this expensive canvas or something and it makes you nervous about using it. So what she did was, and you can see this is a coverlet, and each one of these originally had feathers in it. And she said there were almost no feathers, but she cut the back of each little square and got her vacuum cleaner and sucked out the remaining feathers. And then she used all kinds of techniques, painting, batik. She said there's even some rust on this to color the background. And then here's a detail of the faces, each one hand-stitched. And Shin Hee said that for her, her art is really important because when she came to the United States, she didn't speak English, and she basically lost her language. And so art for her was the way that that was her voice. So anyway, well, that is a very brief and quick version. I want to share with you, I brought one piece with me. And it's by Eric Wolfmeyer. It's not a piece that's in the book, but Eric is the only Iowa quilter who is in the book of the 20 quilters, and the only male, I should just say. This is a piece called One Life, and Eric lives in Iowa City and was really generous to loan me this piece because it's valued quite high. It makes me a little nervous to have it, but it has 4,228 pieces in it, I think. And Eric, I don't know how. Press B. Beth, she's in the other room. I don't know how to do it, I'm sorry. Okay, turn off the image so we can see the quilt. Thank you. Eric is an interesting quilter in that thank you very much, he pieces his quilts. They're obviously very intensive to do, and he does them one at a time, and then he sells them, most of them, and then he goes on to another one. And all of his pieces are hand quilted by Amish quilters in Indiana. And Eric started as a photographer. He has a degree from Washington University in photography. So I would recommend, if you go to all the websites of these artists, because there's a lot more interesting information. My goal in doing this was really not to have biographies that told you what exhibits they were in and what their degrees were, but really to kind of get at the heart of why they did what they did and how it was connected to the Midwest. So, are there any questions? Elise?
So you just said that he had Amish quilters help him do the quilting. Is that common that people
It's
at their work?
It depends. I think a lot of art quilters do their own quilting, and some of them consider that a real part of the art. But Eric is very interested in the piecing, and so he has quilters do it for him. But a lot of traditional quilters also send their quilts out to be quilted. Yeah.
So it's still considered your quilt?
There are different categories if you're going to do a show, like collaborative, usually, and the quilter definitely will get credit. Eric says it's very interesting that the Amish quilters want no credit. They don't want, yeah. So, anyone else? Anne?
So are most of the quilts hand quilted, or are some of them machine quilted?
So Anne asked if most of the quilts were hand or machine quilted. It varies. It depends. And again, that's sometimes very important to the artist that they do that work by hand. Shin Hye Jin, who I just showed you her work, she really likes to do the work by hand. She said, I feel like it connects me to women in the past. She said, I feel like a machine is like a power tool that makes you go faster and you can make bigger things, but that's not what she likes. So I think it really has to do with the philosophy of their work, too, in addition to the time they might have or what.
The really fine ones?
Those were machine done. Those were machine done. So, yeah. Julie?
I was having trouble with the one that's on the wires with pieces. What's the scale of that?
Oh, I'm afraid I don't have that with me. It's in the book.
Now, is it like big or is it?
I think it's like this, but I'm not 100%. It's in the book and I can't remember off the top of my head.
You haven't seen it then?
I have not. That's one I really want to see too. I mean, I really want to see all of them. I mean, it was so exciting when I did get to see LuAnn Rimel's quilts, the really intensively stitched ones, to see them in person. So, Elise?
Just a little sideways from the subject of the book, and more about the aesthetic and just group. So guild kind of society situation. Do people join those because they get together and do things, or is it more just to have people to bounce stuff off? Is it all of those
It's
things?
all of those things, and I think it's an interesting question because the Modern Quilt Guild, when I mentioned I wrote that story about Etsy in 2010, that was when they first formed. Before, it had all been online. And if you're a quilter, you want to touch fabric. So that's a lot of why those modern quilters came together, is they, yeah, it was great to see people's blogs and all of that, and they do want to bounce ideas off each other. And I'm a member of the Old Capitol Quilt Guild here, and the best part is show and tell, when you get to see what everyone else is doing that month, and it's very inspiring. And yeah, and then we have workshops, and all the Modern Quilt Guild does that same kind of thing too. So, yeah.
And do they have apprentices?
I
Like in
don't.
the old guild days?
Not that I know of, but everyone can come and learn to quilt, and yeah. So, yeah. Anyone else? Nope. Okay. Well, fortunately, Linda is here, so thank you very much. Thanks so much for coming.
Linda collects Hmong Story Cloths and has traveled to Hmong villages in rural Laos and the last refugee settlement in Thailand. She is the author of Hmong Story Cloths, Preserving Historical and Cultural Treasures. And I will just mention that both of these authors will be outside the room after 11 when this session closes. And they have their books and will autograph books if you wish. So please join me in welcoming Linda.
Hang on, oh, wait a minute, how do I advance this? Oh. Hang on.
Start talking.
So my story book, as she said, is Hmong Story Cloths, Preserving Historical and Cultural Treasures. And I became interested in story cloths while I was living in the Twin Cities. I taught nursing at the University of Minnesota, and I moved to the Twin Cities so I could work with the Hmong population. And I was familiar with story cloths from quite some
I
time.
need to give you a better mic. Nobody can hear you on the channel. Sorry.
This is not my day.
That's okay. It's Book Fest.
But I am flexible.
Okay, there you go, and let me. Musical. Pay no attention to the minion behind the curtain. Okay, there you go.
Okay, I still don't know how to advance.
The arrow keys on the keyboard.
Okay, let me just,
These right here, over here.
those over there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Left or right?
Okay, so I want to provide you with a little background information to make these story cloths more meaningful. First question people usually ask me is, who are the Hmong? If you're not living in one of the states where there's a high population of Hmong Americans living. They are an ethnic minority. They're an ethnic minority wherever they live. There's been numerous attempts throughout history to provide them with a written language. It wasn't until 1952 that one was adapted by a group of missionaries that they actually took seriously, but there were still very few that wanted to adopt that language. They saw that as, when it's adopted from an outside group, created by an outside group, they saw that as a measure of control over their lives. So anything that we know about the Hmong people are written by other groups. And the earliest written documentation shows them living in China. But think about that. The earliest written documentation by another group shows them in China. That's going to have some meaning as we progress through here. And they rebelled against the Chinese oppression during the Han Dynasty. And at that point, they migrated out of China to Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, and Burma. But I'm going to focus on those who are living in Laos at the time of the Vietnam War. But it's important to know that even though they migrated out of China, there's still the largest population of Hmong anywhere in the world continues to be China. So just to tell you a little bit about life in Laos, they lived in the high to preserve their culture, to live away from the dominant culture. They had an agrarian lifestyle and they were extremely self-sufficient. The story cloths are going to represent that. And women were known for their exceptional needlework skills. They had a relatively peaceful life until 1961. In 1961, the Vietnam War covertly spread into Laos, and that was known by many as the secret CIA war. They had a base in Long Chen, and the U.S., the Hmong people monitored the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They obtained secret information for them, and they rescued downed pilots, American downed pilots. In 1975, primarily because of the opposition here in the United States, the U.S. withdrew their troops. They airlifted out the leaders and the high officials of the guerrilla warfare, and the rest of the Hmong needed to leave by foot, get to Thailand by any means possible, because the communists had set out to annihilate them. That was their mission, to annihilate the Hmong. So the book on Hmong Story Cloths is divided into a number of chapters, one being the Hmong people's journey. So here we have a story cloth that represents, it's an abbreviated version of the Hmong who are now living in the United States. It shows them in China, it shows them at Longchen Air Force Base. And all of the story cloths that I selected were chosen based on superior needlework skills. And then I became friends with one of the men who was stationed at Longchen from the CIA, and he provided these additional photographs for me. This one in the upper corner is a picture of a woman. Now, first of all, they had a little business district, and they had a little market. That was out in the open. You see the dirt floors, or the earthen floors, more politically correct, and this woman is having a tooth extracted or a tooth repaired, and it's hard to see, but the drill is foot pumped. It's a foot pump drill. And there's her little son sitting there patiently waiting. In the lower corner, there's a school, there's a market area, and then you can see the runway on the Air Force Base. I think some of these slides got deleted because I had them on my computer, and this is a different version, slightly different version. So that puts us at a little bit of a disadvantage. This shows them after America withdrew from the secret CIA war, the Hmong refugees needed to flee by foot until they reached the Mekong River. They did not know how to swim because they lived in the mountainous areas, and there's no large bodies of river in the mountainous areas, no bodies of water, river or ponds in the mountainous area. So they had to swim across or find a way to get across the Mekong River. And they used, often they used bundles of bamboo underneath their armpits as a flotation device to get across. Sometimes there were people along the shoreline that sold inner tubes and boats at extraordinary prices. And I just want to share, this book has a quote that I want to read, and maybe I won't be able to do that. Is there a way I can flip the light on for a minute, or is there a light close by that I can use? I hadn't planned on it being quite this dark up here, and I just had cataract surgery a few weeks ago. Okay. It was a long, hard journey down, well, this is by Song Li Veng, who is pictured here on the left, and she has a number of story cloths included in this book. She has the earliest story cloth, which was done between 1975 and 1980, which is up here if you want to see that after the presentation. And she lived at Bon Vinai refugee camp, which is in the lower right-hand corner. That was the largest refugee camp that they had for the Hmong people, and it's usually the most famous. It's usually the one that you hear about. The picture was taken of her and her husband at the Hmong New Year, and he died while this book was in the process of being written, so this is a very nice tribute to both of them. And this is what she wrote. She had a personal journal, and she allowed me to use many of the excerpts from that. It was a long, hard journey down the mountains to the river. but we continued for weeks as we experienced hunger, danger of being spied upon by communists, sickness, and oftentimes the death of family members. Food was so scarce that we sometimes dug roots from the ground to use as a source of nourishment. People died from sickness, hunger, and even bombs that were dropped whenever escapees were spotted. Sometimes family members were shot and killed while the rest of the family had to keep moving, lest they be killed too, as was the case of my sister's baby. The horror stories can never be fully expressed as they actually occurred. I have frequent recollections of my brothers screaming and crying as we were in danger of being hit by gunshots so often. And for those carrying babies, any scream from a baby would reveal the location of all the family and put all the family in jeopardy of being killed. And I had another slide, but it didn't show up on this version. The refugees, once they got to Thailand, they lived in refugee camps from 1975 to the mid-1990s, which was about 1975 to 1995 or 96. After that, if they had not relocated to a host country, such as the United States, France, Canada, they would have to be deported back to Laos. If they went back to Laos, that would have been their death. And there's a real interesting story in the book about Wat Takabao, which is a Buddhist monastery. And they allowed the refugees to come there and build a refugee settlement alongside Wat Takabao. And this was created by one of the women who was living there. And I purchased that probably in 2002, something like that. And they were not forced to leave there until 2005. This is a photo, and this is all done in embroidery, and they use no embroidery hoops, which I find totally amazing. This is some statues in the Buddhist monastery. It shows the Enlightenment phase. And there is a Buddhist nun who was responsible. It's a fascinating story, but she was responsible for the Hmong coming to Wat Takabao. And she predicted it in 1975, and it's detailed in the book. And if it hadn't been for her, they wouldn't have been able to come there. And this is a picture of her tomb. And the Hmong are burning joss sticks, and they are paying tribute to her. And to this day, the Hmong people often wear, the elders who were involved in the secret CIA war, often wear a pendant around their neck with her photo. Where was it? Yeah. It was in Thailand. It's about 90 miles outside of Bangkok. But that was closed in 2005. And there were 15,000 refugees living there, and they came, most of them came to America. These are some photos. I had an opportunity to visit Wat Takabao 2-3 times. Third time we couldn't get in. It was closed off from outsiders. But these are some photos they had of their life there. They had a relatively nice existence. Most of them were very satisfied living there. They were able to practice their cultural beliefs. And in the upper left corner, it shows, and this book incorporates, in the slide that was missing, this book incorporates photos to parallel the actual story cloth content. And story cloths were created, and that content was also eliminated from this version. Story cloths were created as a means to communicate. The Hmong had a very proud heritage, and they wanted to share this heritage with the outside world. They couldn't communicate with them because they had their own dialect. So they used their artistic skills. They didn't know art for the sake of art. They did not know that. But they used their artistic skills to create this new form of art to share their life with the world, and that gave them a means of money because they needed to buy all of the essential items that they used in the refugee camps. The women cooked over a wood-burning stove, it was just a ring, a metal ring around a pile of firewood, and they would put a cooking pot on that. They could not, when they went to the refugee camps such as Ban Vinai, they could not go out into the woods and collect their wood themselves. If they did, oftentimes there was men out there waiting for them to take advantage of them. They even had to buy their own wood. They had to buy their food, they had to buy everything, and they had limited resources with them because all of their silver bars and things that they had collected over the years were left back in Laos. This story on the right-hand side is a marketplace, and this is where, in Wat Takabau, and this is where they sold some of their story cloths. And if you could blow this up 100-fold, you could see some of the little treasures hiding in those shadows. And I was in seventh heaven going through that marketplace. This is a photo of a wedding, and this, I believe, is the groom. This is the bride, and this is her bridesmaid. And one of the story cloths that are included in this book shows extensive representation of a wedding that occurs ideally during the Hmong New Year. And this other gentleman is smoking tobacco with a bamboo water pipe, and my friend who went with me to Thailand and to Laos assures me that it was, in fact, tobacco. It was not anything else. It was tobacco, and I trust her with my life, or I would not have gone to Laos with her. So I do believe that. The women were known for needlework, the men were known for their silversmith. And this is a photo of a silver necklace that is worn during the Hmong New Year to show the wealth of the family, and that is from my personal collection. The traditional life in Laos. This is traditional village life, and let's just advance this to hone in on some of the key factors. As I said, things were made by hand. They were self-sufficient. This on the upper left-hand corner is a woman grinding corn. Usually that is a two-step process, but she was demonstrating for us. And it's shown in the right that is being ground, and they use that to feed the livestock and also to feed the chickens. They didn't usually eat that. And this picture with them showing this image of them feeding the chickens is amazing to me because the stitching is done in such a way you can see the directional growth of the feathers and clusters of feathers. The rooster has his beak slightly open, and there is a kernel of corn in that beak. And if you could get up close to see the basket that the man is holding, it has kernels of corn that they use variegated thread, yellow and white. And then over here in the next image, in the evening hours, the women would go out and collect water, and that was also a time of sneak courting. And this man is playing a violin, a 3-string violin, and they interject a lot of humor, which I love, and she is not looking very happy to me. And if it hadn't been cut off, you would see the man, and he's very relaxed, and he's smiling, playing his 3-string violin, but he does not offer to help. And the water, they use an aqueduct system, and that's how the water is collected. And there is so much information. These story cloths are so rich in knowledge in telling their stories. I totally became addicted to them. Here's another example, and just to hit a few highlights. They use slash and burn farming, and this is an example of that. And they plant dry rice. They planted crops until they completely exhausted the soil of its nutrients, and then they would take all the brush, all the dried vegetation, and burn it. And then they would let that soil sit for 10 to 20 years, and they would move on to burn it, they would move on to another location, and then they would come back at a later date. And they had dry rice fields, not wet, because they were up in the mountainous areas. So they used dry rice farming, and the wet farming was in the lowlands. This picture over here is the rice stalks, and they would feed that to the livestock. But once again, they're living cohabitating with nature, and so the rats are coming in, and they build nests in the rice stalks. And here the men are coming along with their torches. Everything was homemade back before the war. They're coming in trying to scare them off. The Hmong had a very intimate relationship with nature and with the things that grew around them. And you can see the papaya tree to the far right. And you can see the fruit that is at the top, very small, green, and as you go down, they become larger and a brighter yellow at the time that they're ready to be picked. And you can see the same with a bunch of bananas. And they also use that blossom on the banana trees for some of their dishes. But you have to wash it very carefully or it will burn your mouth. Yes, you got and the book has like 233 photos in. So I was so lucky to find this publisher, because most publishers do not want to provide color photos because it's expensive. Every page of this book is glossy. And I had X number, and the publisher says, more. And I couldn't believe it. So we ended up with 233 photos and 3 black and white vintage photos. And the book also includes a lot of artifacts, photos of artifacts to parallel what is taking place in the story cloths. And it also includes quotes throughout the book of Hmong life in Laos. Now, this is a very rare story cloth because it includes a photo of harvesting opium. Opium was a cash crop. It was sold primarily to others, and the only thing that they used it for was pain medication and if somebody had diarrhea. That's not to say that they didn't have some people who got addicted, however. And these photos were taken in a trip that I took to Laos in about 2001, and it shows, the lower photo shows the villages in the background, poppies in the foreground. And up here you have the poppy heads. You scrape it with this instrument that has 3 metal prongs, and then the opium begins to ooze from that plant. And then they scrape it off, collect it, weigh it, and these are all original opium tools. That picture was taken from a museum. I had a woman who had some, but she was afraid to have me use that photo in the book in a tribute to her. Just very briefly, as I said, they made everything. They made their own clothes out of hemp fiber. And this particular story cloth shows the process of making it. And then I've supplemented it with one of the hemp skirts that were dyed with indigo batik and applique and cross stitch. And there is the woman who is working on a skirt. That photo was actually taken in Laos during my visit. This shows shamanism. I'm going to have to zip through. This is very interesting because they traditionally believed in shamanism, spiritual healers. They were not introduced to Christianity until the 1950s. This is also a very rare story cloth that shows a Christian church. And the Hmong are walking along the path with their Bibles. This is a photo of a Christian church in Laos back in 1996. It is made of woven bamboo, and there's the inside of it. It was taken by a Swedish researcher, and he allowed me to publish this. Didn't charge me a thing. He was so generous, so very generous. I do not believe that that church is there any longer. Once the communists took over, they said that they had a religious freedom, but that is not the case if you look and see some of the realities of what Christians endure in Laos. Yep. Oh, okay, I just want to end this. There's folktales, and folktales provided us with a knowledge of what the moral values were of these people. And there are also story cloths that show their neighbors. These Hmong people selected the groups of neighbors or ethnic minorities. They self-selected them. And this one that I have is huge, and it shows the various, Laos has way over 40 minorities, depending on the source as to how many. I've even seen as high as 70. And they have self-selected which minorities they want it to represent. These various landmark buildings are scattered throughout Laos in various geographic regions. And by looking at this, and as you get to understand the Hmong, you can compare and contrast some of their working behaviors, some of the tools that they use, some of the equipment that they used, and just in a very brief statement that I have concluded the book with, the beauty of the embroidered fabric reflects the beauty of the enduring spirit that soared despite the physical containment in the crowded squalor of refugee camps. This was their method of recapturing their culture and transferring their culture that they were so proud of to the American people and to subsequent generations. Okay, you got.
Again, I'll just say that the authors will be outside in the hall, and your books are available for both of them. And I know, Linda, you brought at least one cloth. Do you want to take it out to the table?
Sure. This is a very early cloth, and I'll have it out there so you can look, so that you can see what their needlework skills were very early on, and their artistic skills, and how that changed over time. There's so much information. I'm just so sorry I had to zip through it.